So what we're dealing with here is I want to explore the existence of God, search for arguments that prove the existence of God, and we argue a lot in the modern era of whether or not God exists, and that's skipping over a few steps, because there's really two things that need to happen before we can argue if God exists. The first is an ontological problem that we face, and the second is an epistemological. So the ontological argument, or the ontological problem, a problem from being, a problem of being, is it possible for God to exist? Because if it's not possible for God to exist, then the whole thing is moot. Like if there's no way a God could exist, then why are we arguing over whether or not a God does exist? And the second problem is an epistemological problem, a problem of knowledge or knowing, and that is, can we know that God exists? Because if we can't know that God exists, then even if it's possible for him to exist, and he does exist, then it's moot again. We can't know, so neither of those mean anything. So first we have to deal with this ontological problem before we can deal with the epistemological problem, before we deal with whether or not he does exist. But so the ontological problem is what I'm dealing with in this video, on our search for does God exist, on our search for God. And so the how we deal with the ontological problem is we look at the so-called ontological argument. The ontological argument was named by Immanuel Kant in his Critique of Pure Reason, but it comes a while before Kant. So the primary text for this argument is first Saint Anselm of Canterbury, in his Proslogion, I believe that's how you pronounce it. Apologies if it's not. Chapters 2 and 3, and that work is really interesting because they're chapters, but it's really a whole writing of prayers. So it's him praying to God, and each of the chapters is a different prayer. So chapters 2 and 3 deal with God's being. Then the second one is Rene Descartes' method. Sorry, I have this written down wrong, but it's Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. And in the fifth meditation, he deals with the existence of God. Yeah, so meditation 5 concerning the essence of material things, and again concerning God, that he exists. So those are my sources on the ontological argument, as Kant calls them, and I should have some links to those down below if you want to do your own research on them. So we get to this question: is it possible for God to exist? So ontology, or the ontological problem, ontology is the key word there, the ontological argument. Ontology is the philosophical study of being. And so the ontological argument tries to make a case for God's being itself, thus attempting to answer the question of whether or not it's possible for God to exist, and also at the same time they use it to prove that God does exist out of necessity for his possibility to exist. So we'll get a good taste of both of those, but it's really seen as the possibility of God, and also at the same time, but less strongly, the existence of God. So it operates under this axiom that God is the greatest and most perfect being. So Anselm points out that if a greater being existed that was greater than God, then that lesser being could not be God, Instead, the greater being would have to necessarily be God. So let's say we have a being A and a being B. And we say being A is the greatest possible being. But being B is greater than it. Well, then being B has to be the greatest possible being, right? Being A can't be the greatest possible being if it's not greater than being B, right? So we call being B the greatest possible being. It is perfect in being. Nothing is greater than its being. It is what we would call God. So when we compare these A and B's, being B is always the greatest possible being. Um, so we can actually see Saint Anselm mention this in his Proslogion in chapter 3. He says this: "For if any mind could think of something better than you being God, the creature would rise above the Creator and would sit in judgment over the Creator, something which is utterly absurd." So again, we see if something would rise, if a creature would rise above the Creator, so if being B would rise above being A, then it would rule over the Creator, and that would be absurd, which is totally true. The created ruling over the Creator, that's not possible. So the being that rules over all the other beings must be God. Otherwise, we're dealing with a totally absurd subject, inverse of logical rules. So it follows then that if God is the perfect being, he must exist if he is being at all. Because we'll see here in a sec with Descartes, being necessitates existence. God cannot be a being that does not exist, because being a part of being is existence. It's an aspect of being. So God cannot be perfect in being without existing. Something that is being but that does not exist does not exist. There's no in between. So Descartes actually puts this quite well, as opposed to how I just put it. He says, "But nevertheless, it is obvious to anyone who pays close attention that existence can no more be separated from God's essence than its having 3 angles equal to 2 right angles can be separated from the essence of a triangle, or that the idea of a valley can be separated from the idea of a mountain. Thus, it is no less contradictory to think of God, that is a supremely perfect being, lacking existence, that is, lacking some perfection, than it is to think of a mountain without a valley." That's in his Meditation 5. So basically, what he's saying is God's existence is inseparable from his being, just like how a mountain is inseparable from its valley, or what do you say about triangles? 2 right angles, or having 3 angles equal to 2 right angles, so 3 angles summing up to 180 degrees is inseparable from the idea of a triangle. God's being is logically connected to his existence, just like the logic of a triangle, which makes total sense. But again, philosophy is going to try to set out these axioms so that we can toy with the logic. We make a logical statement and then we shift it around, keeping it logical, kind of like algebra. You want to do whatever you do to the left side, you got to do to the right side. We do the same thing with logic and philosophy. We shift the logic around in different ways so we can see what happens to it. So he's making a statement that seems almost common sense. God exists, therefore he exists. Yes, but he's doing it so that we can toy with it and understand where we're going with it. So, unfortunate for this, an argument can be brought forward, an attack can be brought forward, that we think of things all the time that don't exist, right? Like, He uses the example of a winged horse, a Pegasus. A, a Pegasus exists in our minds, right? Like I can think of a winged horse, but just because I can think of something doesn't mean it exists. It exists in like a possible world, in possibility, but that doesn't mean that it exists in reality. So I can logically understand that something could exist, but that is very different from it existing in actuality. It could exist, but that doesn't mean that it does exist. So Anselm has this to say to that. He says, and what he understands in his understanding, even if he does not understand it to exist. For that a thing is in the understanding is distinct from understanding that this being exists. So Anselm uses some very weird language here and everywhere, but there's this separation from understanding and existence, right? Just because we can understand something to exist doesn't mean that it does exist, like we were just looking at before. So there's a separation. But we go back to the axioms we set before, right? This almost syllogism that we had before. If A and B, then C, right? So if A is the greatest possible being, but B is greater, then B is the greatest possible being, right? So let's think about it this way. If we have two beings, right? Again, we have A and B. Let's say A exists in possibility, like the winged horse that we had earlier. A exists in possibility. We can think of its existence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it exists, right? We think of its existence. But then we have this other being, this being B, that does exist because it is more perfect for a being to exist than to not exist. So the greatest possible being is in existence because it is better for it to exist than not exist, and this one it only exists in possibility. So this one's in possibility and this one's in reality. This one must exist because it's in reality. It's greater than the other one. So if I picture a being in my head as the greatest possible being, but I think about it not existing, then it is not the greatest possible being. Because again, that goes against what Descartes was saying. For it to be a being at all, it must exist. So that greatest possible being that I'm imagining but doesn't exist isn't the greatest possible being. Instead, the greatest possible being is the one that I can imagine and exists. So, in other words, if you can imagine a perfect being, then that being must exist by necessity of its perfection. So we'll look at Descartes here and what he has to say on that in his fifth meditation. But there is a sophism lurking here. From the fact that I am unable to think of a mountain without a valley, it does not follow that a mountain or a valley exists anywhere, but only that, whether they exist or not, a mountain and a valley are inseparable from one another. But the fact that I cannot think of God except as existing, it follows that existence is inseparable from God, and that for this reason he really exists. Not that my thought brings this about or imposes any necessity on things, but rather the necessity of being but rather the necessity of the thing itself, namely the existence of God, forces me to think this. For I am not free to think of God without existence, that is, a supremely perfect being without a supreme perfection, as I am to imagine a horse with or without wings. So there it is. The idea of God's existence is inseparable from the idea of God itself, just how a mountain without a valley is logically inconsistent. God without existing is logically inconsistent because the greatest possible being necessitates existence. And again, it's not our minds that bring that into reality, as he says. It's not our thinking that he exists that makes him exist, but the mere fact of the necessity of the thing itself that forces us to think this way. It's not something that we think God to exist in reality, and therefore he does exist in reality by consequence of our thinking. We think that he exists in reality by consequence of his existence in reality. Anselm says this in chapter 2, therefore, if that than which a greater cannot be thought were only in the understanding, then that than which a greater cannot be thought would be that than which a greater can be thought. But surely this conclusion is impossible. Hence, without doubt, something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in understanding and reality. So basically what he's saying is this: if I can think of something existing in possibility, that doesn't necessarily mean it exists in reality, right? It exists in, let's say, a possible world. Like this winged horse exists in a possible world. Now I think of God, or this greatest possible being, and this greatest possible being is possible, so it exists in the possible world with the winged horse. But for it to be the greatest possible being, it must exist in the real world as well. So the greatest possible being penetrates almost the line between possible and real and enters into the real. So it exists in this possible world, but because it's the greatest possible being, it must also exist in this real world. So it's very interesting. Basically, the omniscience the omnipresence of the greatest possible being means that it is present in both the possible world and the real world. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the greatest possible being, and we wouldn't be having the conversation about the greatest possible being. It would just be a being that is possible but not real. So for it to be the greatest possible being, it must exist. And so the most common critique of the argument is very interesting. So a lot of people like to say, well, what if there was a greatest possible shoe? And this greatest possible shoe, because I can imagine its existence, I can think of it in this possible world, it must exist in the real world by necessity of its possibility of being. And well, the problem is this one is shot down by a lot of intellectuals, both for and against the existence of God, and for and against the ontological argument, because it's really kind of nonsense. And the reason being, not just like out of a argument from authority. I don't necessarily want to portray that that's what it is, but I just want to bring that forward. What is the greatest possible shoe? You know, if someone asks that question, like, what's the greatest possible shoe? Like, if there was a greatest possible shoe, it must exist. And you ask, okay, well then what's the greatest possible shoe? A lot of different people are going to give a lot of different answers, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong, but you can kind of think through the idea of why it's wrong because of people giving different answers. And it kind of comes down to this. If you were to say what the greatest possible shoe is, let's say it's like a hiking boot. Is it the greatest possible shoe because of its leather? Because of its lacing? Because of its high ankles? Because its sturdiness? What makes it the greatest possible shoe? Or if someone were to say ballerina slippers were the greatest possible shoe, what makes that the greatest possible shoe? Is it the ribbons? Is it the color? Is it the flat front? If I were to go hiking in ballerina slippers, it wouldn't be very fun. And if I were to do ballet in hiking boots, it wouldn't be very fun. So what makes that the greatest possible shoe? It's kind of subjective. It's limited to specific areas, whereas the greatest possible being is it's a logical conclusion. The things that are involved in being are raised to the perfect extent. So like when I've heard it said, like, what if there was a greatest possible pizza? Well, what's the greatest possible pizza? If I think it's Hawaiian and you think it's pepperoni, then the greatest possible pizza is kind of nothing. It's negligible. Or if the greatest possible pizza is pepperoni pizza, okay, let's say that. When does it become the greatest possible pizza? How many pepperonis do we need to add? How much cheese do we need to add? What's the thickness of the crust that makes it? And where does it go over from greatest possible pizza with just the right amount of pepperonis into the wrong amount of pepperonis? It's one of those things that I don't know if it works for anything else, but it works for being. And the reason is because it's abstract enough to where it's specific enough to where we know being, and that it really only works for being. So the perfect being is pretty easily recognizable, and most people throughout history have recognized it as the greatest possible being. Not just the Abrahamic religions, but others outside of the Abrahamic religions recognize the greatest possible being as like having attributes of omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, and all that. So it's an argument that doesn't really hold up, and it's probably the most common critique of the ontological argument, but it doesn't really hold up too well. So if I didn't portray this well enough, I apologize. I am obviously not the greatest possible being, so I probably didn't give this. Actually, I know I didn't give this explanation the greatest possible attention, greatest possible explanation. So I apologize for that. If you're interested in reading more, I highly suggest checking out the original sources. They're actually quite easy to read if you sit down and think through them and underline, highlight. It's really not much. Online sources can help you with that as well. And once you have and I'm hoping this is a basic understanding enough to help you understand the ontological argument. If you want to delve further into it, you can with the primary sources. But I'm hoping that this explanation helps us pass on to the next question. But before I move off this to the next question, you can check out, you can order both of these books, the Proslogian and the Meditations on First Philosophy, online. You can probably find Meditations in a bookstore. Proslogian is probably going to be very hard to find in a bookstore, but you can order them online. I also have I should have PDF links down below that'll lead you to sources that have them, so you can read them for free. They're in the public domain, I believe. So I have Descartes, but Proslogian was definitely in the public domain. So you can find those very easily, and it's not hard. It's Proslogian chapters 2 and 3 by Saint Anselm of Canterbury and René Descartes. Meditations on First Philosophy, Meditation 5. So please go check those out and study them for yourselves if you're truly interested in using the argument, or if you're more interested in disproving the argument than or showing its logical inconsistencies, then go check out the source material, please. Don't leave it to me. Don't try to disprove my understanding of the ontological argument and say that you disproved the whole ontological argument, because that would be bad. But the next question is, we've dealt with this ontological problem. Is it possible for God to exist? We've shown that it is possible for God to exist according to the ontological argument, and it tries to explain that because it is possible for God to exist, he must necessarily exist, but that's besides the point, because we don't know if we can even know if God exists. So we've shown that it's possible for God to exist. Now we have to know if we can. Now we have to figure out if we can know that God exists, and that'll come to this epistemological problem, this epistemological argument. So so I hope to see you there at the epistemological argument, and thank you so much for following me on this search for God.